Okay, hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to a free-range conversation with the American Farmland Trust. We host these live stream conversations so that we can tackle some of the most pressing challenges in agriculture across the United States. Today, we're talking about beefing up farm to school with New York products. My name is Michaela Perry. I'm the New York Policy Manager. I have nearly a decade of experience working in agriculture, and I'm also a fifth-generation farmer. I grew up on a diversified livestock farm, so I'm very excited about this conversation. I also hold a master's in food studies, and prior to my role as policy manager, I spent 3 years working for AFT on the Farm to Institution New York State program. We also call that FINESS. FINESS is a statewide collaborative led by AFT, and our main mission is to empower institutions across New York State to increase their procurement of New York food products. We house the Buyer Learning Center as one of our project areas where we produce various food guides for institutions so that they can learn how they can incorporate these local products into their existing menus. So this conversation was developed, which is the New York Beef Guide, and will be released at the end of 2023. So without further ado, I will go ahead and I will introduce our panelists. So first, joining us, we have Jeremiah Best. Jeremiah has over a decade of experience as a classroom educator and now is the statewide educator for New York agriculture in the classroom. He's worked with students and educators to understand how they can learn and teach through the lens of agriculture. Jeremiah's classroom pedagogy is for students to apply the core standards that are being taught and learned in all content areas through student engagement and authentic learning opportunities in the natural world. And I'd also just like to mention that Jeremiah won the 2020 New York Ag in the Classroom Teacher of the Year Award. So we're very excited to hear from him. We also have joining us Jacob Gilley, who does work for AFT. So Jacob coordinates AFT's Sustainable Grazing Project, working with producers in Central Virginia to increase awareness of holistic practices focused on improving soil and water quality, the positive impacts of responsible grazing on carbon sequestration and producer profitability. Before joining AFT, Jacob was a field technician at a local agricultural supply co-op where he helped livestock and crop producers with soil and forage sampling, nutritional and agronomic recommendations, and sourcing farm inputs. Through college, he was an airplane engine mechanic with the 130th West Virginia Air National Guard and was a FarmLink intern at the Virginia Department of Ag. He serves on a number of local agricultural boards and has a lot of experience. He also grew up on a small farm and currently raises cattle on a larger scale, implementing several best management practices to include stream exclusion, a winter feeding facility, hardened stream crossings, and a grazing management plan. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Animal and Poultry Sciences from Virginia Tech and a Master of Science in Career and Technical Education with an emphasis in agricultural education from Virginia Tech. He is a nutrient management professional animal scientist for beef and dairy and beef quality assurance certified. So you can address any technical questions about that to Jacob. And finally, we have Julia Van Loon, who is the founder and president of Slate Foods Incorporated. A long-standing advocate for child nutrition and school food reform, Slate Foods began working with public schools in 2002 to develop and enhance food service programs through sourcing more local ingredients and incorporating scratch cooking techniques for menu enhancement. Slate Foods holds a strong belief that New York should strive to feed its own as much and as often as possible, as the state's land is bountiful, beautiful, and ripe for connection between farms and community. Slate Foods began producing New York State beef for public K-12 schools in 2012 as both an alternative and more sustainable option to the USDA commodity beef that was used in school meal programs. As both a WBE and New York grown and certified business, Slate Foods attributes its company's growth to a long list of amazing partnerships and loyal customers who both support and share its values. So we are very lucky to have these three folks on the line, and feel free to add your questions so that we can hear all they have to say and all of their wisdom. And I'll jump in with the first question. So each of you has such an interesting connection to cattle farming and beef. Can you walk us through what a day in your life might look like and how you interact with either cattle or beef, even as a topic? So I'll go to you first, Jeremiah. Do you work with beef in any regard in education?
Yes, so we've partnered quite a bit with our New York Beef Council, and we've worked with other agriculture organizations really to focus on teaching through that lens of agriculture and capturing for educators and students um, what those content areas might look like if you taught through the lens of beef farming, things like ecosystems and your math and science STEM standards. They're naturally applied within the classroom when you can overlay that with beef. And so it's a great partnership with agriculture and what happens daily within the classroom as you start to tweak those different standards and overlay them with concepts that you find within the industry. So on a daily basis, we work with our partners, our agricultural partners in their classrooms to make those connections, not just through curriculum, but also act as a bridge in making connections where classrooms go out to the farm and they learn about those proteins that, number one, they consume every day if they don't think about it or not, and start to understand those networks. And it's a great opportunity for our producers to be able to connect to the classrooms. And we find that many of our producers want to connect to the classrooms and don't know how. So we really kind of act as that bridge in between those two groups as well as communities.
Great. And Jacob, I know that you're working with beef in a lot of different ways. You're working with farmers and you also have your own farm. So what does a day in the life look like for you?
Yeah, definitely. And when you said walk us through a day, I feel like every day I'm running, but it's great. You know, my wife and I, we have a diversified livestock operation. So we've got cattle, we've got sheep, pastured chickens, hogs, and we direct market as well. So that's a whole nother level of complexity. But for us, we feel that it gives us a lot more reward and being able to speak with our customers and see all of our hard work pay off. So working with American Farmland Trust full-time as our Mid-Atlantic Sustainable Grazing Manager, I have the pleasure of working with a lot of different producers in the region to assist them with adopting regenerative grazing practices. And so I might wake up and check email and answer phone calls for 2-3 hours, and then go out and feed cattle with the kids and rotate them around, and then certainly hop back into full-time AFT stuff. And a lot of what we do, we help develop individualized plans for producers that not only take into account their livestock, but we also look at it holistically, like you mentioned earlier. And so we look at wildlife. Specifically, we've done a lot of work around grassland birds, soil health, water quality, family dynamics, so succession planning. But most of all, we try to help producers with record keeping and profitability, because we feel that if they're not profitable, then it's certainly hard to be sustainable. But, you know, good thing that they created lights, because we do a lot of work early in the morning and late at night. But I wouldn't have any other way. It's a good place to raise a family, and really enjoy helping producers through AFT.
Great, thanks. And, I know we're here to talk about procurement. And when we think about local food and institutions, a lot of the time folks do jump right to procurement, but you both are working with kids in some capacity. And Jacob, you have a family, and Jeremiah, you're working in classroom education. And so I'm curious, could either of you speak a bit to the benefits of local food and connection to local food in terms of raising up the next generation of farmers?
Yeah, it's really, when we think about our population and only 2% actually in production, but 20% employed in agricultural sectors, and population growth, it's that next generation that we're going to need to have some of these issues that we're facing as far as production on a larger scale, and the science that's going to progress how we produce. We have a lot of bright young students who have the potential to go in the field and come up with those solutions. So by helping them understand the networks, their food and fiber networks, beef networks, and understanding how those things are sourced and produced, we can start to help our students apply what they're learning in the classroom, and coming up with those solutions. So you'll find as students start to engage within these agricultural sectors, they get very excited because they see, oh, that math lesson that I just learned about, I see that there on the farm, and I see how it's used, and I want to learn more, and I want to learn how to apply it. So it's just a natural progression as we can get more students to think about those networks and actually get out on the farm. We also see with educators, they start to see those concepts taking place every day. You have a farmer like Jacob who lives the standards that are taught in the classroom. As teachers and students get out and see that, it's like, oh, I can see how these things are working within the real world and within the food that I consume every day.
And I think for me, with raising the kids on the farm, I mean, it's just an appreciation, for the land and the natural resources that we've been blessed with, and converting those over into usable food, fuel, and fiber that the consumers can appreciate. And I think also a level of patience. They realize that things don't always go the right way, and having a plan B, C, and so on. And then, through AFT, we've been able to work with elementary, middle school students down at the creeks and talk about water quality and help them look at indicators of water quality and how producers are trying to maintain and improve. And then we've also had the opportunity, taking it back to a local food systems, to work with some high schools around poultry processing and doing some demonstrations for those students. And they're actually able to get in and get involved with their hands. And I think for that, it, again, gives them an appreciation for the food that they eat, but also it ties everything together. The anatomy and physiology that they just learned in the classroom, they can kind of see that process and how it works. And again, it's just, human skills of appreciation of life and death, and how that helps them survive and thrive.
Absolutely. I always tell folks that I learned my multiplication tables stacking hay bales in the back of a truck with my dad. And when I was, in kindergarten, first grade, I'd have little fights in the cafeteria with my friends about whose cow's milk was in our carton. And so I do think it's really important. These are real life skills. Even if kids don't become farmers or producers, it's really good for them to be learning all of these other skills in an experiential way. Hi, Julia. Welcome. We're so excited to have you. I read your intro, so folks are primed to hear from you. And no worries. We're so glad you're here. And I'll just, we're still on the first question. So I want to ask you, with everything you have going on, Jacob said he runs through his day. I'm sure it's the same for you. I want to know, what does a day in the life look like for you working in the beef industry?
No one day is the same, and there's some repetition, but it's usually centered around working with schools, aggregating orders, meeting new partners, going into the classroom and the cafeteria, pre-COVID a lot more. Hopefully, that'll return soon. Working with cooks, buying cattle, having them hauled to be harvested every week, usually about 10. So working through all the paperwork and compliance, being New York grown and certified, I work with select farms, and most of them are really all about the selective dry cow therapy, which is a really beautiful effort for mitigating overuse of antibiotics on farm. So it's the harvest, then it's what am I going to do with all that trim, and where's it going to go? What kind of product is it going to become? Obviously driven by orders, and then changing that 10 times before the a week is out because of new orders or changed orders. And then partnering with logistics companies, I can get most of the trim down to my processors, but then we partner with 9 different warehouses that distribute directly to the schools. So the lead time for that, and it pretty much starts again next week.
Great. And Julia, I just love your story of how you created Slate Foods. And I'm wondering if you can just share with folks, what was the moment that you said something needs to change in New York for procuring beef?
Probably the 5-pound dilemma, which was, I had a culinary background, and I was working with schools back in the early 2000s. And I went to a seminar, and this doctor took a 5-pound bag of flour and he ripped it open and he dumped it. And it literally, it got everywhere. It got all over the people who were in the front row. And he said that this represents the amount of antibiotics an animal will have in its lifetime in a commercial setting. And this was when growth promoting antibiotics and hormones were rampant. And the next day I went to one of my schools, and the USDA commodity beef had just come in. And I was like, I guess this is what they're talking about. And I was like, can we do better? I mean, New York has so many dairy farms, and I knew that dairy was a good source for ground beef. My husband had worked on dairy farms, and he said, he thought maybe like 20%, and it actually could be even more. So I scrambled to start talking to people. I met somebody in the beef world, and I guess a few years later, we produced our first ounce of local New York beef, and it just took off from there. And my goal was always that New York really can feed its own. And I think when the pandemic came and we saw the regional supply chain become so robust and become so appreciated and so supported, it was pretty validating.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. And just so folks know, what are the products you sell to schools?
Oh, ground beef, both bulk and patties. We make a New York hot dog, which is just spices and beef. We even source our own fat to add to that, so the ratio is correct. A cooked meatball from our New York State beef, and we're now working out some challenges with New York chicken. That's been a little more challenging, but we're getting there.
Great. Okay. When we release a chicken guide, we'll follow up with you, see where you're at. Great. Thank you all so much. So I'll jump to the next question. So cattle are important players in environmental health. What do each of you wish more people knew in terms of beef and environmental sustainability, which includes soil and water health? And I'll pass this to you first, Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for folks to realize that much of the ground that our ruminants like cattle and sheep and goats are grazing, we always talk about grass-fed, but they also eat other plants like forbs, woody species, clover, legumes, so it's a really diversified mix that we're after. In addition to grass, and much of that forage grows on land that's not suitable for other types of production like vegetables or even corn, soybeans, and row crops. And so we're pretty much utilizing those forages to capture the sunlight and energy from that sun to build up nutrients and sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and put it down into the soil. And the really cool thing about grazing is those animals go and they eat that vegetation, and then that stimulates new growth out of that forage, which sequesters more carbon through photosynthesis. And so I think the biggest thing is that a lot of times folks will want to look at livestock in a negative way, but they also forget that we're majority forage-based diet, and that these pastures that we're maintaining with livestock also provide really good habitat for wildlife like grassland birds that they don't like the woods, and so a lot of folks say, well, just let everything grow up into forest. But there's a lot of species of wildlife that really enjoy our vegetative pastures. And the last thing I'll mention is a lot of wildfires throughout the country are issues. And so utilizing grazing livestock can help maintain that vegetation and help prevent massive wildfires.
Absolutely. Thanks. Jeremiah, we'll jump to you next.
So I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the industry and agriculture as a whole. I think if you look throughout the country, in any sector, you're going to have, folks that take advantage of different things. But one of the stories that we hear as we take teachers and students out to farms and have them engaged in farms is that our producers are stewards of the land, and they're passing the baton from one generation to the next, and something that they pride themselves on more than producing beef or agricultural products is to be able to pass better land than when they pass that on to the next generation than what they started with. So there's a lot of focus within the industry of using science and new concepts and new advancements in science to create better product and to do better. And I think there's a lot of conceptions that that's not the case. So for our students and our teachers, as they get out and they get to see that and talk with they are, a lot of them, surprised to see those standards that they're learning in the classroom to apply. When we talk about water, protecting water and water sources and soil health, that's something our farmers are engaging in every day, and our students are learning about every day. So that's one of the big things, is that it's always hoping to move forward and produce quality products and create quality ecosystems.
Yeah. And I see we lost Julia momentarily. And so we'll circle back on this question, because Julia is working with dairy farmers, and there's a lot to be said for sustainability of using cattle for multiple purposes. So while we wait for Julia to reconnect, we did get a question in the comments. So we'll just go ahead and chat about this for a little bit. What's the biggest challenge schools face when trying to get more local beef or any farm product on the plates of students? I have my own thoughts, but why don't we go to you, Jacob? I know that you've brought up quite a few challenges in conversation with me, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different challenges that we face looking at local food systems. And I think the one that pops to mind the most is the expense or the cost financially. When we're sourcing from smaller producers that may not quite be as efficient as a vertically integrated, highly optimized, commodity scaled beef system, those add on additional cost, anything from the production side, but also the processing side, and then distribution as well. And so each segment of that has higher cost than, say, a well-oiled commodity beef system. And that's why that system has excelled in supplying, beef throughout the country. So cost would be number one that needs to be overcome, but also consistency of product. And I think that's why the ground beef works so well because it's more or less a homogenized product that can be utilized to prepare lots of different types of meals. And so we see that as the largest opportunity in comparison to trying to source steaks or individual packaged cuts of meat. But I would say those are two of the bigger challenges that we face.
Great. And Jeremiah, how would you answer that question?
I think Jacob hit the nail right on the head with that. I think there's so much bureaucracy when it comes to, or red tape when it comes to cost and budgets. That's just, we have to rethink how funds are allocated, and that can be extremely tough as budgets and, thinking of inflation. Those things can be very tough for districts.
Absolutely. And in New York, we're lucky to have, a really strong policy initiative, which actually reimburses schools if they can reach at least 30% local procurement. So it's not a perfect program by any means, but we are actually leading the New York Grown Food for New York Kids Coalition to improve that program, with the hopes that when schools are able to reach that 30% threshold and get that reimbursement, they will have additional funding to continue to work with their local farmers. So that's another project that AFT champions in the state. But there are so many challenges, and not even mentioned are just the challenges in terms of, paperwork, certifications, administrative work. It's, schools are over capacity and farmers are really busy. And so it's like, who takes on that administrative burden? If there's processing that needs to happen, transportation, especially to rural school districts, these are all challenges that do exist, and really are in some cases a deterrent. So AFT also is working on a producer training pilot program to try and address some of these challenges and train producers across the state. And we can put in the comments more information about some of the opportunities we have for farmers who are interested in these institutional markets, but aren't sure how to even get, their foot through the door and start working with schools. And Rebecca Henriksen actually just commented, and I just like, it's not a question, it's a comment, but I think, it's great from the school side to see also the challenges. Regulations are a big hurdle for our school district when we want to work with local small producers. And I just wanted to show that comment because it's so true. And there's interest to bridge the supply chain from, local mid-scale producers into schools, but there are challenges on both ends. And that's where someone like AFT can really come in and support. So Julia, I'm so excited that you're back. I'm sorry about your connection. And before we got into that, we were just talking about question 3, cattle are important players in environmental health. What do you wish more people knew in terms of beef and environmental sustainability? And I really wanted to hear your answer because you're specifically working beefing dairy cattle. And I think you have a unique insight into this question.
Yeah. And I mean, the answers that came, I actually did hear them. I couldn't even begin to answer to that as a cattle and grazing, because the dairy is really closer to a CAFO than it would be in New York, at least. They aren't really free roaming as much. They do rely on feed. But I do know that some of the dairy farms are working, and it's not only, the soil health is also, the antibiotics play a big role in that, because ultimately that's where it goes, right? And so to mitigate the overuse of antibiotics, important antibiotics for human health, are definitely important measures for land stewardship. And one of the farms that I'm working with, and I'm learning a lot more about this, is anaerobic digesters on farm, which are expensive and very, very technically specific to purchasing, to training, but it's really doing a lot for better land stewardship by having these anaerobic digesters on the farm. And I'm certainly not an expert on it. I can't really speak to it. So I think that the fact that the antibiotics are 75% lessened when you do more selective dry cow therapy, you do more proactive animal welfare before doing herd-wide antibiotic administration, just because that's the way it's always been done. They're finding now that at least 75% reduction in antibiotics on the farm that are not going to go into the soil. And so that's a very important thing.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Great. Okay, so we'll jump to the next question unless anyone wants to add anything on that one. I know there's so much more we could say. All right, hearing nothing. So the next question is, what piece of advice would you give a beef farmer or producer who is interested in selling wholesale to institutions or working more with schools, such as through programs like Ag in the Classroom and building those connections? And I'll start again with you, Jacob.
Yeah, so for a producer that's interested in working with wholesale, hopefully they have some experience with direct marketing to retail first, to get their feet wet and get an understanding of the production side of the business prior to trying to scale up and sell wholesale. So I think until a producer can optimize the systems that they have in place for production and direct marketing on a smaller scale with direct consumer, they probably shouldn't be looking at wholesale. So that would be number one. Wholesale typically is a little less profitable per pound or per animal. And so at that point, again, you have to be willing to scale to a certain level to provide that consistency, which the schools need. So therefore, you need to have a really good idea of your inventory on your cattle side, but also you need to have processing secured through a USDA inspected processor so that you're able to sell. And that goes back to the question or comment earlier about regulations. The nice thing about meat production is as long as we work with USDA inspected processors, that meat can be sold across state lines in comparison to, like, say, vegetables and fruit, where you potentially may have to be GAP certified. A lot of times that USDA inspection takes care of all the requirements there. So again, have a good idea. And then cost would be my last thing, is making sure you know your numbers, because it's easy to lose money if you don't understand your cost of production and if you don't put a value on your time as well. So anything from the production side to delivering that animal to the processor to picking up the meat and then delivering it to a wholesale account like a school or institution, putting some sort of value on your time and all your other expenses and making sure that you're making a profit. Again, getting back to that sustainability component, it's extremely important.
Thank you. Would you say that there's, like, if someone's a small scale beef producer, is there any hope of working with schools, or do you think it's very challenging and you're just being realistic about those challenges?
No, I think there's hope for sure, but I think also being realistic with what your goals are. And so I always tell people, before you get bigger, get better. And until you stop having people pounding down your door to buy your quality local meats, which you can sell at maybe a higher margin, you likely shouldn't be looking into restaurants or wholesale. Right. But now there's pros and cons. So there's more time invested for each individual consumer that you sell to. And there's cost with that versus if you deliver 200 pounds to a school, that's a bigger sale, one interaction. And so your time investment could be less. But I think with wholesale accounts, it's easy to put too many eggs in one basket. So if you've got just a handful of really big accounts and you lose a few of them, then your whole business could tank. And so I see them as an opportunity, like restaurants, to get your name out there. But they can be challenging because a lot of times margins are very thin in restaurants. And within a school system, I really like the ideas of schools supporting lots of different farmers, and maybe not trying to be a sole provider, but if you could be one of many, and it's a way to potentially sell some product that you're having a harder time getting sold to, direct consumers. I'd see that as an opportunity.
Right. Absolutely. That's great advice. I'll jump to Julia because you're still more on the procurement side of things, and I'd like to save the education piece and building those sorts of relationships for last with Jeremiah. So Julia, go ahead. Do you want me to repeat the question to just refresh your memory? Okay. What piece of advice would you give to a beef farmer or producer who is interested in selling wholesale to institutions?
Well, first of all, that was really, really, you covered that perfectly, Jacob. There's like, if you want to go fast, go.
Okay. All right, Julia. We're having some tech issues. It's hard to hear you. It's a little choppy. So I am going to jump to Jeremiah to talk about building connections with schools for that curricula
to
component,
collaborate.
and then we'll come back to you. All right. Jeremiah, can you hear me?
I was muted.
Yes.
By you.
Okay. Great. Okay. So what advice would you give to any beef producers who would like to build a relationship with any schools or institutions in their region, or who maybe would be interested in partnering with Ag in the Classroom? What do those opportunities look like?
Yeah, I would say, one of the first things would be to reach out to your Ag in the Classroom. We have a national organization, so an Ag in the Classroom in almost all 50 states, and those are housed as nonprofits. So there are a few different ways that those are funded, but you can definitely reach out. So you just Google Ag in the Classroom and your state. You can find the connection there. Always, reaching out to your 4-H FFA programs and inviting them out to the farm. Just kind of building on those markets and identifying some of the things that Jacob was talking about as you're building your beef business out. To have that transparency where you invite families, students, teachers out to your farm, they start to understand where their food comes from, and start to support those local businesses, just as a family and on that family base. I know through Ag in the Classroom, we offer competitions and contests focused on beef and other of our commodity groups. And we're always looking for producers to partner with, to do virtual field trips, to speak with groups. And we're always open, as well as other groups, 4-H groups and FFA groups, to having producers come in and talk to students and making those connections and those pathways, because we think it's very important. And a lot of our producers find that they enjoy it. They might think that they like to be in the backfield most of the day, but as they start to get students and teachers on the farm, or engage with teachers and students, they start to see the excitement for agriculture, which is kind of like a gold star on our producers charts. And it's always feels good to have a gold star. So there's a lot of appreciation that starts to be built. So just reaching out to the local groups and being willing to invite folks out throughout the year to share who you are and what you do, because our producers and farmers are very important to us. And I think as people start to engage, there's definitely a greater appreciation, and it benefits our producers because they start to purchase product locally.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I think that can be said in any scenario. Always just feel free to reach out and build that first connection. Thank you. Julia, can you hear me okay? All right. It seems Julia might be frozen. So we have only a few minutes left. So I'll just wrap it up really quickly. What is your favorite beef recipe? And I'll start with you, Jacob.
Favorite beef recipe. Honestly, especially this time of year, I just really enjoy a good bowl of beef chili. It's just a lot of complexity and textures and flavors, and it's hard to mess up. You just can throw a bunch of stuff in there, and utilizes ground beef, which is a very, like I mentioned earlier, versatile product, and almost half of the total beef animal ends up as ground beef. And so getting creative, and again, these cold days, it's hard to beat a bowl of chili with some melted cheese for sure. Got to support the dairy industry too.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if anyone else has been to a chili competition, but they're very fun. Jeremiah, how about you? What should we make with beef?
I'm a purist. I like a nice steak with butter on the grill and a baked potato. Nice cold Dr. Pepper. And I'm in hog heaven or beef heaven.
Great. Okay. Awesome. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Jacob, Jeremiah, and Julia. If you can hear me, thank you all so much for joining us today. This was really fun. And thank you all who tuned in. We're so happy to have you. And I hope you stay connected to Finesse. Reach out if you have any questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks.